My landlord asked me how Chemo was going, but I don't have cancer. I stared at him in complete confusion. Chemo? The landlord looked concerned and said, "Your husband told me about the breast cancer. I know you're going to beat it." He added that was why he hadn't been pushing about rent. My husband Miles was coming up with groceries and his face went white when he saw us talking. He quickly guided me away from the landlord, and I managed to say I needed to rest. I confronted Miles immediately, but he just set down the groceries slowly, not meeting my eyes, and admitted he hadn't paid rent in 6 months. He'd told the landlord I had cancer and we needed the money for treatment. 6 months at $2,000 a month meant $12,000 that should have gone to rent. My mind raced back through all the fake receipts he'd shown me that rent was paid. When I demanded to know where the money went, he admitted he'd lost it gambling, thinking he could triple it for a house down payment. The casino charges he'd claimed were fraud, the weekend construction jobs that paid cash, the nights coming home at 4 in the morning claiming he was helping his brother, all lies covering his addiction. I made Miles show me everything on his phone, and the truth was worse than just the rent money. Our savings account that had held $30,000 for our future was completely empty. The emergency fund we'd spent 3 years building was gone, and the checking account had $17 left, $73,000 total. Gambled away while I'd been working double shifts as a nurse, picking up overtime every week, skipping meals to save money because he said we needed to be careful with spending. The landlord had lost his wife to cancer 3 years ago, which explained why he hadn't pushed for money when Miles told him I was dying. Miles had weaponized a widower's grief to fund his gambling addiction, using the man's personal tragedy as a tool for manipulation. He'd told his entire family I had cancer too, which explained his mother's recent tears during phone calls, his sister dropping off casseroles every week, his brother's sudden offers to loan us money. His coworkers had sent a care package last month and taken up a collection for my medical expenses that Miles had cashed for $500. People who could barely afford their own bills had contributed thinking they were helping a dying woman. He'd created elaborate fiction about treatment schedules, about insurance not covering experimental drugs, about me being too proud to ask for help, all carefully crafted to explain why we were suddenly broke without revealing his gambling. The worst part was he'd used breast cancer, the disease that killed my mother 5 years ago, as his cover story to everyone who asked. He knew what that disease meant to me, how I'd watched her waste away, and he'd turned it into a convenient lie. Now the landlord would want his $12,000 or he'd evict us within 30 days, and Miles had already thought of a solution. He begged me to tell the landlord the treatment worked, that I was in remission, but we still needed time to recover financially from the medical bills. He wanted me to extend his lie, to look our grieving landlord in the face and pretend I'd survived the same cancer that killed his wife. He said the landlord would give us more time if he thought I was recovering, that Miles could get a loan from his parents by saying it was for follow-up care, still using the cancer lie to manipulate everyone's sympathy even after being caught. I stood up and looked around our apartment that we'd certainly lose. 3 years of marriage and building a life together all gambled away at blackjack tables while I thought we were saving for our future, for kids, for something real. Miles followed me to the bedroom, reminding me I had to decide what to tell the landlord who would definitely ask about my treatment again. If I told the truth, we'd be evicted immediately with nowhere to go and no money for a deposit anywhere else. But if I played along with the cancer lie, just for a few months, Miles swore he could fix everything through loans and getting help for his gambling addiction that he was finally admitting existed. I thought about the landlord's sympathetic face, how he'd probably been remembering his wife's final days when he gave us grace on the rent, how he'd left flowers at our door last month with a note about staying strong through the hard times. The eviction would destroy my credit and make it impossible to rent anywhere decent for years. But lying to a widower about having the disease that killed his wife felt like the worst kind of cruelty imaginable. "What are you going to tell him?" Miles asked. I stood there frozen while Miles waited for my answer, my mind racing through everything I'd just learned about our destroyed finances. My mouth opened, but no words came out, and finally I managed to tell him I needed time to think before I talked to the landlord again. Relief washed over his face like I'd just given him hope, but I was already making a mental list of what I needed to do to protect myself from whatever came next. Miles started to reach for me, but I stepped back and walked straight to where he'd left his wallet on the kitchen counter. "What are you doing?" he asked as I grabbed it along with our shared credit cards from the drawer. I didn't answer him, just walked out to my car and locked everything in the glove compartment while he followed me nervously, hovering in the doorway but not daring to physically stop me. He knew he had no right to protest anything I did now. Back inside, I pulled out my laptop and sat at the kitchen table while Miles paced around the living room. I started with our bank accounts, changing every single password while he finally gave up pacing and collapsed on the couch. My fingers shook as I typed new passwords into each account, seeing that $17 balance over and over again in our checking account. The savings showed 0. The emergency fund showed 0. 3 years of careful saving, of me working doubles and skipping lunches, all gone. I changed the passwords for our utilities, our phone accounts, everything I could think of that had online access. Miles tossed and turned on the couch, the leather squeaking every time he moved, but I kept working through every account we had. By 3 in the morning, I couldn't focus on the screen anymore, so I got up and opened every cabinet in our kitchen. I counted cans of soup, boxes of pasta, the half-empty jar of peanut butter, trying to calculate how long we could eat on what we had. Maybe 3 days if we were really careful, 4 if we stretched it. I made a list on the back of an envelope of which bills absolutely had to be paid first. The electricity and my car insurance at the top, the credit cards at the bottom. Miles woke up while I was still writing and immediately launched into his plan for what I should tell the landlord. "Just say you're in remission but still weak from treatment," he said, following me around the apartment. He started throwing out medical terms like neutropenia and maintenance therapy that he must have looked up online, telling me exactly how to make it sound believable. His desperation made my skin crawl, but I just nodded and told him I'd handle it my way. He looked relieved again, probably thinking I was going along with his plan. I had to be at the hospital for my shift at 7, and I'd gotten maybe 2 hours of sleep. I dragged myself through getting dressed, my scrubs feeling heavier than usual, my eyes burning from exhaustion. Miles kept talking about the remission story while I brushed my teeth, suggesting I should say the treatment worked faster than expected. I left without saying goodbye. At work, every single thing reminded me of his lie. I had 3 cancer patients that morning, and looking at their IV ports and their thin arms made me want to throw up. One woman about my age was getting her first round of chemo for breast cancer, and I had to excuse myself to go cry in the bathroom. I splashed cold water on my face and went back out. Then 20 minutes later had to excuse myself again when her husband held her hand and told her how brave she was. During my lunch break, I sat in my car in the hospital parking garage and stared at the concrete wall in front of me. I made a decision right there that felt small but important. important. I would not lie to the landlord about having cancer. I would not look that man in the eye, knowing his wife died from the same disease and claim I'd survived it. I'd figure out another way to handle this, but I wouldn't add my own cruelty to Miles's. A coworker knocked on my car window, startling me out of my thoughts. "Hey, I heard about your diagnosis," she said when I rolled down the window. She offered to cover some of my shifts so I could focus on treatment, her face full of genuine concern. The shame burned through my chest, and I mumbled something vague about taking things one day at a time, not confirming or denying anything. She patted my shoulder and walked away, probably thinking I was being brave or private about my illness. After my shift ended, I sat in the hospital parking lot and called the bank from my car. I had to know for certain that the casino charges weren't some kind of fraud or mistake, that maybe Miles had been telling the truth about that at least. The representative was cheerful as she pulled up our account history and confirmed that yes, all those charges were legitimate transactions from Miles's debit card at various casinos in the area. She asked if I wanted to dispute them, and I said no, thanked her, and hung up. I drove to a different bank branch across town, one where they wouldn't know me, and walked in with the $20 bill I'd had in my purse. The teller smiled as I opened my own checking account with that pathetic $20, not commenting on the small deposit, though I could see the pity in her eyes. Wonder what Miles was thinking as he watched our landlord's face light up with sympathy every month for 6 whole months? There's something really strange about how he picked breast cancer specifically, knowing about the narrator's mother. That feels like such a calculated choice for someone who's supposed to just have a gambling problem. I called HR from the parking lot and had them redirect my next paycheck to the new account, giving them the routing number while my hands shook. The next morning, I woke up at 5 after barely sleeping and grabbed my laptop to search for free legal aid while Miles snored on the couch. I typed in different combinations of words like tenant rights and eviction help and finally found a website for a nonprofit that offered free consultations. The first available appointment with an attorney named Colette Barr, who specialized in tenant rights, wasn't until tomorrow afternoon, which felt like forever away. I booked it anyway and wrote down the address on a sticky note that I stuck inside my purse where Miles wouldn't see it. My phone showed 17 missed calls from his mother, and I deleted them all without listening to the voicemails. I got dressed for work quietly and tried to slip out without waking Miles, but the landlord was in the hallway checking his mail when I opened our door. He looked up with such genuine concern on his face and asked how I was feeling today and if the new treatment was helping with the side effects. My throat closed up and I managed to tell him I needed 24 hours to discuss our situation properly with Miles before we could talk. He patted my shoulder gently and said, "Of course, take all the time you need," and I could see him remembering his own wife's struggle. I practically ran down the stairs to escape that kindness I didn't deserve. That evening after my shift, Miles was waiting with a whole speech prepared about what would happen if I told the truth. He pulled up websites on his phone showing how evictions stay on your record for 7 years and pointed at listings for apartments in bad neighborhoods. He kept saying we'd both have this on our records forever and asked if I really wanted to live somewhere with break-ins and shootings just to take the moral high ground. His voice got louder as he listed all the places that would reject our applications and how we'd never get approved for a car loan or mortgage. I didn't respond and just went to the bedroom where I stayed up until 3 in the morning reading our lease agreement line by line. The joint and several liability clause was right there in black and white, meaning even if I left him tomorrow, I'd still be responsible for the full $12,000. The eviction would destroy my credit whether I stayed or went, unless somehow the entire debt got paid, which we both knew was impossible. My eyes burned from staring at the legal language, but I kept reading and taking notes on a pad about payment plans and cure periods. At work the next day, I was measuring medications for a patient when my supervisor, Elspeth Blanchard, asked to speak with me privately in her office. She closed the door and gently mentioned that my performance had been slipping lately with several minor errors and missed documentation that wasn't like me at all. She slid an employee assistance program pamphlet across the desk and said they offered free counseling for personal issues that might be affecting work performance. I took the pamphlet and promised to do better, even though I knew therapy couldn't fix having no money and facing eviction. She looked worried, but let me go back to my shift where I tried to focus on my patients instead of the disaster of my life. My phone buzzed during my break with a voicemail notification from Miles's mother that I couldn't ignore anymore. Her voice was thick with tears as she sobbed about how strong I was and how proud she was of me for fighting this terrible disease. She went on about how her grandmother had beaten breast cancer too, and I was going to get through this, and she was praying for me every single day. Each word felt like another brick on my chest, making it harder to breathe, and I had to sit down on a bench outside the hospital. She said Miles had told her about the new treatment plan, and she wanted to come visit to help take care of me, but I should rest and focus on getting better. I deleted the message and went back inside for the rest of my shift, feeling like the worst person alive for letting this go on. The next afternoon, I drove to the legal aid office in a strip mall and met with Colette Barr, who turned out to be younger than I expected, but very direct. She listened without judgment as I explained the whole situation, including the gambling and the cancer lie and the $12,000 we owed. She pulled out forms and templates for payment plan proposals and explained the eviction process step by step, including how long we'd have at each stage. She warned me that judges rarely sided with tenants who were this far behind, but having a payment plan proposal ready showed good faith effort. I took notes on everything she said, and she gave me her card saying to call if the landlord filed formal eviction proceedings, which we both knew was coming soon. When I got home that evening, Miles was on his laptop, and I asked him point blank about the $500 his coworkers had donated for my medical expenses. He closed the laptop slowly and admitted he'd used it for groceries and gas because we needed to eat, and I needed to get to work, didn't I? The casual way he justified spending money people had donated for cancer treatment made me realize I needed to protect myself immediately before things got even worse. I went to the bedroom and quietly gathered my birth certificate from the filing cabinet and my social security card from the drawer where we kept important papers. My passport was in the closet, and my nursing license was framed on the wall, which I carefully removed and put the document in my purse. Miles didn't notice what I was doing because he was staring at his phone where he was apparently researching Gamblers Anonymous meetings and making a list of locations. The next morning, I took all my documents to work and locked them in my locker in the break room where I knew they'd be safe from whatever might happen next. When I got home that afternoon, I stood in the doorway and told Miles he had two options: either start attending GA meetings immediately or move out today. He agreed quickly and said he'd already found a meeting for tonight and showed me the screenshot on his phone as proof he was serious. I wondered if he was just saying what I wanted to hear or if he actually recognized how bad things had gotten, but either way, I needed him to try something. The next morning, Miles left for work like nothing had happened, and I waited exactly 10 10 minutes before I started searching our apartment. I checked his dresser first, pulling out every drawer and feeling behind them, then moved to his side of the closet where I found his old gym bag stuffed behind winter coats. Inside were receipts from the casino dated 3 days ago, after he'd sworn he was done gambling forever. I kept searching and found 3 prepaid debit cards hidden in his sock drawer with about $200 total on them, and the receipts showed they were bought yesterday, right after he'd supposedly hit rock bottom and promised to change. My hands shook as I put everything back exactly how I found it, because I couldn't let him know I was checking up on him yet. That evening after Miles got home, I told him I needed to go talk to the landlord, and he immediately got nervous, asking what I was going to say. I just walked out without answering and knocked on the landlord's door, my heart pounding so hard I thought he might hear it. When he opened the door, his face lit up with that concerned smile that made my stomach turn, and I forced myself to speak before I lost my nerve. I told him Miles had a gambling problem, and we were behind on rent but working on a payment plan, and I watched confusion replace the sympathy on his face. He asked about my treatment, and I just stood there unable to say the words about the cancer lie, so I mumbled something about needing to focus on our financial situation first. He said he'd need something in writing soon about the payment plan, and closed the door looking disappointed, like I'd somehow let him down by not dying of cancer. My phone buzzed later that night with texts from Miles at his first GA meeting, sending photos of himself in a church basement with folding chairs arranged in a circle. He said someone named Eugenie Ayers was his temporary sponsor, and she seemed really helpful and understanding about addiction. His messages were full of apologies and promises to change, saying this time was different because he was getting real help. But I'd heard these exact words before when he'd promised to stop staying out late. I spent my next day off at the kitchen table with all the templates Colette had given me, using our one working laptop to draft a payment plan that would take 18 months to pay back the $12,000 we owed. The numbers made me sick because even if I picked up extra shifts every week and Miles got a second job, we'd barely scrape by on ramen and rice for over a year. 2 days later, I heard something slide under our door and found a formal pay or quit notice from the landlord, giving us 3 days to pay the full amount or get out. The legal language was cold and official, nothing like the kind man who'd left flowers at our door, and I realized he was being more patient than the law required since he could have started this process weeks ago. I stared at my phone for an hour before finally texting Miles' sister that her brother had a gambling problem and I didn't have cancer, asking her please not to tell anyone else yet while we figured things out. Within an hour, my phone was exploding with calls and texts from his entire family, his mother screaming at me for lying to her, his brother demanding to know if Miles was okay, his sister crying about how she'd been praying for me every night. Some were mad at Miles for gambling away our future, but others were mad at me for covering for him and letting them believe I was dying. Miles' mother crying on that voicemail about cancer prayers while I'm sitting outside the hospital makes me question how someone can let a lie grow this huge. Finding those casino receipts and prepaid cards hidden everywhere tells me Miles isn't really trying to change at. At work the next day, Elspeth called me into her office and slid a written warning across the desk, documenting my recent performance issues, including the medication error and multiple instances of being distracted during patient care. She offered to adjust my schedule so I could handle personal matters, and I accepted knowing my job was the only thing keeping us from living in my car. That night, I finally pulled my credit report online using one of the free sites, typing in my information with shaking fingers because I had a bad feeling about what I'd find. The report showed 2 store credit cards opened in my name last month that I knew nothing about, both maxed out at $500 each for electronics and gift cards. This wasn't just lying anymore. This was identity theft, actual fraud using my social security number, and something inside me finally broke looking at those account numbers. I printed out the pages and waited for Miles to get home from work, the papers trembling in my hands as I heard his key in the lock. When I showed him the credit cards, he didn't even look surprised, just said he was planning to pay them off with his next paycheck and didn't think I'd find out so soon. He tried to explain that he'd needed quick cash for groceries and gas, that it was technically our money anyway since we were married, that he would have told me eventually once he'd fixed it. I walked past him to the bedroom and started throwing clothes into an overnight bag while he stood in the doorway watching, asking where I thought I was going to go with no money. I told him I needed space to think about whether I wanted to stay married to someone who would steal my identity and ruin my credit along with everything else. He said it was his apartment too and he wasn't leaving, that I was being dramatic and overreacting to something that could be fixed with a simple phone call to the credit card companies. I grabbed my bag and my purse and walked out while he was still talking, driving to the cheapest motel I could find for $40 a night that I paid with my new debit card from my new bank account. As I pulled into the parking lot of the rundown motel with its flickering neon sign and cracked asphalt, I realized this might be the beginning of the end of our marriage, but I was too tired and broken to care anymore. The motel room smelled like old cigarette smoke and cheap cleaner, but at least it was mine for the night. I sat on the scratchy bedspread with my laptop and started going through every single bank account we shared. First, I removed Miles from the main checking account, which took 20 minutes of security questions. Then I canceled the automatic rent payment that wasn't even working anymore. Next came the utility payments, the gym membership, the streaming services we couldn't afford anyway. Each click felt like cutting another thread between us. My phone rang, and it was someone named Eugenie Ayers who said she was calling from the Gamblers Anonymous meeting Miles had attended. She explained that most gambling addicts relapse in the first 90 days and asked if I wanted to join a support group for spouses. I told her I wasn't ready to sit in a circle and talk about my problems with strangers. She gave me her number anyway and said to call when I was ready. 2 days later, I went back to the apartment to get more clothes and found an official notice taped to our door. The landlord had filed a 3-day notice to quit, which meant we had to pay everything or leave. I took pictures of the notice with my phone and emailed them to Colette, who confirmed this was the last step before court. She said we were running out of options fast. At work the next day, I was counting pills and almost asked my coworker Janet if I could borrow some money. The words were right there in my mouth, but I stopped myself. We'd already taken $500 from Miles's coworkers who thought I was dying. I couldn't add more people to that list. The shame would eat me alive. During my lunch break, I drove to 3 different pawn shops with my engagement ring in my purse. The first one offered me $400, which was insulting. The second one said $500. The third shop was run by an older guy who looked at the ring carefully and offered $800. He said that was the best he could do, and I knew Miles had probably lied about what he paid for it anyway. I took the cash and it felt dirty in my hands, but it was something. I drove straight to the landlord's office and knocked on his door. When he opened it, I held out the $800 and said this was all I had right now. He took it quietly and wrote me a receipt, but we both knew it wasn't enough to stop the eviction. His face showed he was struggling between feeling bad for me and protecting his own own business. The $800 would buy us maybe another week, but the court process would keep going. Back at the apartment, I started gathering more papers for Colette, and that's when I found it. In Miles's jacket pocket was a pawn ticket dated last week. My hands started shaking when I read the description because it was my mother's necklace, the only piece of jewelry I had left from her. The one thing I'd asked him never to touch. He'd pawned it for $300 while I was at work. When Miles came home, I was sitting on the couch holding the pawn ticket. He saw it in my hand and his face went white. I asked him how he could do this when he knew what that necklace meant to me. He started crying ugly tears and saying he was sorry over and over. Then he punched the wall so hard that our neighbor knocked on the door to check if everything was okay. I told her we were fine, but she looked at me like she didn't believe it. Miles's knuckles were bleeding and he was still crying, and I just felt empty inside. The next morning, I packed my essential stuff into 2 suitcases while Miles was passed out on the couch. My coworker Sandra had offered me her spare room for 2 weeks, and even though it was embarrassing, I needed somewhere safe to go. Miles was getting more desperate every day, and I didn't know what he might do next. Sandra's place was small but clean, and she didn't ask too many questions when I showed up with my bags. She just showed me the room and said I could stay as long as I needed. That afternoon, I went to the police station with all my paperwork about the credit cards Miles opened in my name. The officer at the desk was nice, but she warned me that proving identity theft between married people were really complicated. She said the credit card companies might not believe I didn't know about the accounts. I filled out the report anyway because I needed it to dispute the charges with the credit companies. The officer gave me a case number and said someone would follow up in a few days, but not to expect much. While I was there, I asked about getting a restraining order, but she said Miles hadn't done anything violent enough yet. Punching a wall didn't count unless he threatened me directly. I left the police station feeling more alone than ever. The next 3 weeks crawled by while I stayed at Sandra's place and went through the motions at work. Colette called twice to prep me for the court hearing and reminded me to bring all my paperwork. The morning of the hearing, I put on my scrubs since I had a shift right after and drove to the courthouse early. I sat in the hallway watching other people go in and out of courtrooms with their own problems. Colette showed up 15 minutes before our time slot carrying a thick folder and gave me a quick rundown of what to expect. We went into the courtroom and sat at one of the tables while the judge finished with another case. Miles wasn't there yet. The judge called our case number and Colette stood up to say we were ready, but the other party hadn't arrived. The judge gave us 5 more minutes. Miles rushed in 20 minutes late wearing wrinkled clothes that looked like he'd slept in them. His hair was greasy and he had dark circles under his eyes. He mumbled an apology to the judge who didn't look impressed. The landlord's lawyer laid out the facts about the unpaid rent and showed all the documentation. Colette tried to argue for more time based on my steady employment, but the judge wasn't having it. He ruled we had 14 days to vacate the property and entered a judgment for $12,000 plus $1,500 in court costs. Colette managed to get him to list the judgment separately for each of us instead of jointly, which meant I was only on the hook for my half. Miles tried to say something about getting the money soon, but the judge cut him off and called the next case. Outside the courthouse, Miles tried to talk to me, but I walked straight to my car without looking back. At work that afternoon, Elspeth pulled me aside and said Eugenie from Georgia had called looking for me. I called her back on my break and she told me Miles hadn't been to a meeting in over a week. She said she was worried about him, but I told her I couldn't track his recovery anymore. That was his responsibility now. The stress was getting to me bad. 2 days later, I was doing medication rounds and almost gave the wrong dose to a patient. I caught myself at the last second, but had to report it to Elspeth. She documented it as a near miss and put me on a performance improvement plan. She said she understood I was going through a lot, but patient safety came first. If I made another error in the next 90 days, I'd lose my job. I nodded and signed the paperwork knowing my career was hanging by a thread now too. That weekend, I took $400 from my first paycheck at the new account and went to the pawn shop. The guy behind the counter recognized me and pulled out my mother's necklace without me having to ask. He counted the cash and handed over the necklace in a small plastic bag. I put it on right there in the shop and felt like I had a tiny piece of her back. Something doesn't quite add up with Eugenie calling the workplace twice. First she contacts the narrator directly, then she goes through Elspeth. That's an odd pattern for someone from Gamblers Anonymous to track someone down that persistently. The pawn shop owner watched me, and I could tell he'd seen this kind of desperation before. Back at Sandra's, I spent Sunday afternoon writing letters to each person from Miles's work who had donated money. I apologized for the deception and included $10 in each envelope as a token repayment. It wasn't much, but it was all I could afford. Some people wrote back saying they understood and wished me well. Others sent angry messages about being lied to. A few never responded at all. Miles's brother called me the next Friday saying Miles had disappeared. He told his family he was going to a work conference, but his boss called looking for him after 3 days of no shows. His brother drove to all the local casinos and found Miles's car at 2 hours away. Security footage showed him going in 3 days earlier, and he was still at the blackjack table when his brother found him. Miles had lost another $2,000 he'd borrowed from somewhere. His brother dragged him out, but Miles went right back the next day. That's when the calls started coming to my phone. Different numbers asking for Miles, saying he owed them money and they knew I was his wife. One guy said Miles had given them my number as a reference for a loan. I changed my number that afternoon. With 7 days left before the eviction, I rented a small storage unit and started moving things there. I packed photo albums, my nursing textbooks, important papers, anything I wanted to keep safe. The metal door of the storage unit felt heavy when I pulled it shut. It was like closing a door on my old life. Moving day came and I borrowed a truck from Sandra's boyfriend. I loaded boxes while the landlord stood in the parking lot watching. He walked over as I was carrying out the last box and I knew I had to tell him. I explained about the gambling and the lies and how there never was any cancer. His face went from confused to hurt to angry and finally just tired. He looked at me for a long moment, then turned and walked away without saying anything. That hurt worse than if he'd yelled. I drove the truck to my new place, a tiny room in a house with 3 other people. The landlady only rented by the week and wanted cash up front. She didn't run a credit check, which was the only reason I got it. The room had a single bed, a small dresser, and a closet that smelled like mothballs. The bathroom was down the hall and shared with everyone else. I unpacked my 2 suitcases and hung my scrubs in the closet. This was my life now, starting over from nothing at 32 years old. 3 days later, I took the bus downtown to the courthouse with the separation papers Colette had helped me fill out the week before. The clerk at the filing window stamped each page and told me the fee was $312, which hurt to pay, but had to be done. I sat on the wooden bench outside the courtroom filling out more forms while my phone buzzed non-stop with texts from Miles. He wrote that I was throwing away our marriage over money, then 5 minutes later begged me to come home and work things out, then blamed me for for not supporting him through his addiction. I turned off my phone and finished the paperwork, getting a case number and a court date 6 weeks away. Back in my rented room that night, I spread all the financial papers across the narrow bed, every bank statement showing zero, the credit reports with red marks everywhere, the court judgment for $12,000 in unpaid rent. The stack of papers was thick enough to be a small book, each page showing another way Miles had destroyed what we'd built. My hands shook as I sorted them into folders for the divorce lawyer I couldn't afford yet. The early morning bus to work took an hour and 20 minutes now, instead of the 15-minute drive I used to make in my car that I'd sold to a used car dealer for $2,000 cash last week. I sat in the back practicing what I'd tell future landlords about the eviction on my record, trying different versions that were honest but not so detailed they'd reject me immediately. The other bus riders looked tired like me, checking their phones or staring out the windows as we stopped at every corner, picking up more people heading to early shifts. At work, I changed into my scrubs in the employee bathroom and tried to focus on my patients instead of the mess of my life. 6 months had passed since that day the landlord asked about chemo, and everything had fallen apart piece by piece. My credit score had dropped to 412. My savings were gone. The marriage was over, but I was still going to work every day and paying my weekly rent on time. The divorce papers said it would be final in 30 days if Miles didn't contest it, and he kept sending messages about getting help and wanting another chance. I deleted them without reading now, having learned that his promises were worth less than nothing, and some things couldn't be fixed with apologies. During my lunch break, my coworker mentioned her cousin was looking for a roommate in a better part of town, someone reliable who could pay $500 a month plus utilities. She said the cousin was willing to work with someone who had credit problems if they could explain the situation and seemed trustworthy. I wrote down the number and called that afternoon, scheduling an interview for the next day after my shift. The interview meant sitting in the cousin's living room for an hour, explaining everything: the gambling, the fake cancer story, the eviction, the divorce, while she took notes and asked questions. She wanted to know if Miles knew where I'd be living, if I had any other debts, if I could really afford the rent on my nurse's salary. I showed her my pay stubs and the separation paperwork and promised I'd never miss a payment because I couldn't afford to lose another place to live. 3 days later, she called to say I could move in the following weekend if I had first month's rent and a deposit ready. I went to the bank and withdrew the $1,000 I'd saved over the past weeks, keeping just enough for food and bus fare until my next paycheck. Packing didn't take long since most of my stuff was still in storage, and I only had 2 suitcases and a few boxes in the rented room. I folded my scrubs carefully and wrapped my mother's necklace in tissue paper to keep it safe during the move. At the bottom of a box, I found the Employee Assistance Program pamphlet Elspeth had given me months ago, wrinkled and coffee-stained but still readable. I sat on the floor of my almost empty room and dialed the number on the pamphlet, waiting through 4 rings before someone answered. The woman on the phone said they could schedule me for counseling next week, that it was covered by my insurance, that lots of healthcare workers use their services for all kinds of problems. I made the appointment for Tuesday afternoon and hung up, feeling like maybe I was ready to start dealing with everything that had happened instead of just surviving day by day. Thanks for letting me wonder about all these curious details with you today. It's definitely been a journey we got to share. Until next time, friends, if you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.